This is the Power Break Podcast number 020, From the Bottom to the Top. Hi, I'm Bob Brubaker, along with JT, as we hope you'll stay tuned as we seek to give you a little power in this break to help you succeed in the race of life.
This is the Power Break Podcast, with a focus on the spiritual, the mental, the physical aspects, all to help you succeed in the race of life. For show notes from today's podcast, go to bobbrubaker.com and follow the link for the Power Break Podcast.
And boy, howdy, do I got to jump in here and say this. The man came through, folks. As we record this, last evening, he treated us, the man, JT, to steak at the Trevino household.
Yes,
and it was awesome.
Was it worth the wait? That's the most important thing.
You got that right.
That was a long wait, so I guess I really did well with those last night.
Well, you know, I kind of put the pressure on you bringing it up on the podcast, and my wife has put pressure on you from time to time. But you came through, man, and it was really good. Enjoyed being with your family and your friends and enjoying a good evening of steak.
Oh, we loved having you guys over. And, you know, I think now we've established not so good at ribs, probably a lot better at steak.
Although we didn't taste the ribs, I guess we could come over for those sometime.
Oh, no. See, that's how it happens. Next thing you know, we're going to build that drama on the podcast.
All right. I got a question for you, JT. Have you ever hit rock bottom?
Man, yeah. You know, I've definitely had times in my life where I felt like I was at rock bottom, for sure. Mm-hmm. And I can certainly say, I can point those out. One of those rock bottoms led me to Christ, so I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, that's good.
That was right around the time where my mom started to get really sick, and she got diagnosed with a specific form of Alzheimer's, a dementia kind of thing. So, and then when that happened, it was it just really makes you try to figure out why, for lack of a better way to put it. And those questions of why led me back to Christ. Yeah. So,
well, that's a good thing. And many people do that. I mean, the bottom has to come out in order for us to flee to Him. The example, of course, is the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15.
Yep.
When he hit the bottom, he said, "I'm going to go home to my father."
Well, and I'm as stubborn as it gets. So you got a pride problem, you got a stubbornness thing going on. So sometimes I'm the kind of person where you needed the rug to come out completely from underneath my feet for me to get it. So how about you?
Well, I think of the time that I may have been in the pit was, of course, when I was diagnosed with a severe lung disease and thought for the first time, realized that I was not immortal, that, when you do Ironman triathlons, pretty soon you start to think you could go through anything. But it was really a devastating time when they were trying to teach me how to live carrying an oxygen tank around. And I thought, man, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, for a guy who had run multiple Ironman triathlons, always run marathons, busy his whole life, played college football, man, that's just a kick.
Yeah, I was really in the pit. But, God saw us through that, and thankfully I'm not on oxygen today. And but anyway, it was a time when they were telling me these things, I was like, whoa. And it was kind of down in the pit. But we're going to be talking about that as I bring up the matter of looking to come up from the bottom to the top.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But let's go to what's new first, and then we'll get back to that.
Well, obviously, we're talking about that on the What's New. It's the article that I wrote for my blog called the Power Break blog. It's Power Break, the weekly Power Break on bobbrubaker.com. I titled it From the Bottom to the Top because we all face circumstances in which we feel like we've hit the bottom. That's a reality of life. Every one of us feels like that. Wouldn't it be great to have a way to get out of the pit and find your way to the top? There are, of course, no instant cures, but the Bible does make it very clear about a way that takes a person from the pit of despair and sets that same person on the road to a great hope. Now, this pathway is called, and I alluded to it the last few episodes of their Power Break podcast, it's called lament.
Lament.
What happens is when you first think on that subject, you think the very word lament conjures up thoughts of pain or agony. But there's more to it, and much more at that, because 1/3 of the Psalms are actually laments, and the other 2/3 you'll find portions of those Psalms expressions of lamenting in the Bible.
Right.
No wonder when we go through and you're looking for some help, you turn often to the book of Psalms for answers. But what about this lament stuff? Recently, I preached here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church from Psalm 38, and notice the first 4 verses. It says, "O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. For your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down hard on me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me." We drop down to verses 8 and 9. He says, "I am feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. O Lord, all my longing is before you, and my sighing is not hidden from you." And then he concludes in verses 21 and 22. He says, "Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord of my salvation." Now, let me just point out, a lament can be defined as a loud cry, a howl, a passionate expression of grief, or a complaint that is made to God. Now, the difference is, lament is more than sorrow or expressions of sadness, and is much more than just walking through the stages of grief, although they may be included in this lament. A lament expresses a belief in God's mercy, his redemption, and a recognition of his sovereignty, which is the very thing that leads a person to lament, because it's out of trusting God, who is good and sovereign, that the lament is voiced in a petition to God. Now, a rule of thumb to follow in deciphering laments in the Bible is to notice the 4 key points. There is a specific address of God, addressing to God or addressing him, and there are elements of a complaint. You're telling God what's wrong, but you also find a request, and you also finally have a word of trust. Now, they're not necessarily in that order, but you do find it to be there. As I was preaching about this, I noticed that laments come up more often than you think in the Bible, and it does take a person from the bottom or the pit of life to the top.
Right.
Of trusting God, and that's what complaints are all about.
Yeah.
A lament is all about, because a complaint is actually expressing disbelief in God, and oftentimes people become so bitter that they give God the silent treatment. You know, I didn't get my prayers.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to talk to him anymore. Which that's the epitome of disbelief or unbelief. I'm just not going to talk to God. And so a lament is an expression of how you feel. It's unloading the heavy burden that you're feeling. I'm in the pit, and then you're describing it. And often you find David describing it in terms that makes you feel like, man, okay, I'm glad I'm not there, or I identify with that. And that's why the Psalms are so special. But in that, he not only has the complaint, but he's addressed God, expressing his belief in him. He's also made some specific requests, and you also find he does end it more often than not with true expressions of believing God and that he's going to hold to his sovereign help.
Yeah, and that's it. It's a turning over process for me when I lament. And it's really important that I do that, because if I don't, I find that if I hold on to it, then it erodes away my faith, because I'm putting faith in me and not in him.
Oh, yeah.
So
it's called bitterness.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so easy to get there. And I look around me, and there's so many people that just live in that environment where it's just, there's no turning it over, because oftentimes they don't believe that there's a God. Oftentimes they don't believe, if they do believe there is a God, they don't believe that he cares at all about them, which is the worst part. And I love that God talks about David in a way to where he's a man after God's own heart. Mm-hmm. And David suffers the way we did when it comes to this life.
And David lamented.
And he lamented, and he turned it over to, he showed us what to do when we find ourselves in the same situations. Yeah.
I heard a pastor say one time that he instructed his congregation to write a lament for the situation that they were in, and that is very, very helpful. We just take the time to do that, to address God, to voice our complaint. What's wrong? Just go ahead and tell him, and to make it a specific request. And as I pointed out recently here at Christ Community Church, that sometimes you'll find the imprecatory psalms. Now, those are psalms where...
Those are the ones that the guys get into.
yeah. The imprecatory psalms, Lord, I'd like you to destroy this guy over here.
Rain fire down on that dude.
Okay,
Yeah.
but those are actually requests in the midst of a lament.
Yes.
And so when you think about that, that's how he felt. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't that God was condemning him. He was allowing him to voice his complaint. And then he voices, again, a trust in God. And that's the important part of lamenting.
And if you express human anger to God, because human anger does not bring the righteousness of God. It's not the same as his anger. But we have human anger. Anybody who says that they don't is lying to themselves. So to express it and get rid of it to God, to me, is the most natural way for me to express it.
And better than expressing it to one another.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if we express it to one another, we're just complaining.
Yes, and we drive each other away.
Yeah.
So it's not like we're doing what we're supposed to do. I'm not loving my neighbor when I'm teeing off on him.
That's right. Hey, that's a good expression, isn't it?
I'm not loving my neighbor if I'm teeing off on him. That sounds like a T-shirt, actually.
Let's mark that down. Well, that's the Power Break blog this week. It's from the bottom to the top, and you can check it out at bobbrubaker.com.
So what else is going on, Bob? Any news that we need to know about this week?
Well, I wanted to talk about my One Breath from Death book that I put together after my experience in Denver, Colorado in 2005, where, yes, I was one breath from death, but God spared my life, and I like to talk about it and talk about how if God can do that for me, think about what he can do for you. God took me through the time when I was very, very sick, and I have explained all the things that went on, and pictures and everything else to go along with that. In the book called One Breath from Death, you'll find the link on my website, bobbrubaker.com. Scroll through the books and look for One Breath from Death, and you can order the book. Also on my website, there's a link to the sermons that I preach here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church, including the summer series in Psalms that we're in the midst of preaching right now, going through the Psalms. We picked it up at Psalm 38 this year, and we'll go through Psalm 53 by the end of August. And then pick up with a series, I believe I'm going to go through the book of Philippians. But you can check it out. The sermon links are on my website, bobbrubaker.com.
All right. So here we go. It's time for What About This, which is our question and answer time here on the show. If you have any questions for Bob, please email your questions to bob@bobbrubaker.com. We're still working on a JT at bobbrubaker.com, allegedly. Are we? No. Yeah, whatever. I can tell by the look on Bob's face. He's like, I haven't even tried that.
Do you really want to get
Yeah, man, I want to get the questions. You'll be like, hey, so what did you wear today during the podcast? Oh, well, I'm so lazy I didn't even put on regular shorts. I'm still wearing my bathing suit. See? Cool questions like that.
Well, wait till we start podcasting on the video, but that'll be coming...
on video? Oh, God.
Then we'll see.
I have a face for radio, so right. I don't think that's appropriate at all. But anyway, if you have a question, for now, you can go to bob@bobbrubaker.com, and we'll get to answering it on an upcoming Power Break. So are you ready, Bob?
I'm ready.
All right, number one, I want to keep going in the same direction if you're cool with that.
Okay.
Let's talk again about lamenting, and why is it so important for us to not only understand it, but to apply it in our life?
Well, really, when we're lamenting, we're expressing our real feelings to God, and God already knows our real feelings. So if we try to hide those feelings, what we're doing is we're coming in a state of lying to God. So a lament can be defined, as we mentioned before, as a loud cry, a howl, a passionate expression of grief, or a complaint that is made to God. Now, the difference between a complaint and a lament contains a complaint oftentimes, but just to complain is what the children of Israel did when they came out of Egypt, and we don't like this man anymore.
About everything, it seemed.
Yes, they complained all the time. And God judged them for that complaining. For sure. So also we know that just complaining turns us into a very bitter person, and a bitter person, as described in the book of Hebrews, will miss out on the grace of God.
Yep.
So we don't want to do that. So a lament, as we mentioned, is more than just sorrow or expressions of sadness. It's much more than just walking through the stages of grief, although you may find them in the lament. A lament expresses a belief in God's mercy and His redemption and His recognition of His sovereignty. which, by the way, is the very reason that a person will be led to lament, because it's really a cry out of trusting God, and who is good and sovereign, that actually you're voicing your petition to God.
Right.
So a good rule of thumb in deciphering laments in the Bible is to notice 4 key points. Now, they may not be in this order, but I like to express them because it really teaches us how to lament. There is a specific address of God. And many times he talks about God in the covenant way, sometimes translated as Yahweh or Jehovah in the Bible, which means he's addressing the God of the covenant, a God who makes his promises and keeps his promises. If we turn that over to a New Testament principle, in the New Testament we are to address God, as Jesus described, as our Father in heaven. So when we talk to him about our Father in heaven, there's only one way that we can talk to him about as our Father, in the fact that he has made us his children. We know that that has come because of a specific promise or a specific thing that he ordained before the foundation of the world, according to his good pleasure. It says in Ephesians chapter 1 that we would be the adopted children by Jesus Christ to himself. He not only that has given us the power of his Holy Spirit within, and that cry within our hearts is called Abba, Father, as described in Romans chapter 8 and verse 15. That is an expression that says that we are his children.
Right.
So when we address him as our Father, there's that covenant relationship. Of course, if we have a complaint, maybe you've lost a child, maybe you've lost work, or maybe they've gone through a divorce, or something that has really torn you up, well, you turn to God and talk to him about it. And sometimes it's even in a way that's saying, I was not treated fairly. Okay? And you're holding on to that, and you just express it to him. And then finally, you come to a request. What do you want? What do you want God to do about that? And many times, you want God to pick up the pieces and help you through this. And that's, of course, asking is right. And sometimes our asking in a lament seems very selfish, and it seems wrong, but just unload your heart, but conclude your lament with a word of trust in the Lord. He knows what is best.
Now, let me ask you something, and this is off script, so I'm going to get back at you for all the shenanigans you pulled on me in the past. Whoa. Is a lament the first step to forgiveness? And I know that's kind of a squirrel, but I know I personally, when I sit down and I know I need to forgive somebody, like say there's something going on and I'm just tore up about somebody, and you mentioned how somebody didn't treat you how you wanted to be treated, or something happened at work. A lot of times promotion will go to a boss's friend versus somebody who earned it and stuff like that, because that's the world. That's just the way it works.
That happens.
Yeah.
We're in a fallen world.
So if you find yourself, usually it starts off, actually for me, it starts off with a precatory thing. I usually start off, rain fire down on this dude. And then I turn into, sorry.
JT's a real man.
Everybody's like, what is wrong with this guy? But then it turns into a lament for me to turn it over to God. Mm-hmm. But is that the first step to forgiveness?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think it is absolutely right, because how can you forgive unless you feel forgiven, okay, and unless you know you're forgiven? And how will you know you're forgiven if you're holding on to a bitterness, and all bitterness really is a bitterness towards God for the situation that he allowed you to get into.
Right.
And so if you're clearing the air with God, you're clearing the air for enjoying his forgiveness in your life, which gives you the ability then to forgive others. As it says in Ephesians chapter 4, that we forgive as we have been forgiven for Christ's sake.
Right.
So, I think that's a good point, JT. I think it really does bring up that a lament does open that door. But we have to understand the lament does include a complaint, but it is not a complaint. So before you complain, consider a lament.
Right. No, I like it. All right. So next question. From a mental standpoint, why is it so important for us to understand the difference between complaining and lamenting, and how does that help us persevere through life?
Well, it helps us persevere because it opens up the door for the grace of God to flow in our lives, whereas when we hold on to bitterness, it's I used to preach a series of messages about bitterness, and one time I mentioned it. It's like a flow of a hose of grace. I hate to use that.
Hose.
It's like God has this giant hose of grace.
Hold on, let me get the hose. That's usually a statement that requires me to run after it.
Okay. That you've been hosed?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, think of that hose with God's grace just flowing to us every day, okay? And what happens when you are washing the car and you get your hose stuck under the tire?
Oh, that's a great example.
So when it gets under the tire, you get a trickle rather than the flow. And I believe that many of God's people are surviving on the trickles of grace in their lives when God means for them to enjoy the true flow of His grace every day. And that what has stopped is, it says in Hebrews 12, verse 15, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, for by it many are become defiled. So back in Psalm 38, David is just unloading to God.
Yeah.
Rather than being bitter, he says, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. And he says, your arrows have sunk hard into me, and your hand has come down on me. There's no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation, and there's no health in my bones because of my sin. Oftentimes, when we're getting close to God during times of trouble, when we're in that pit, there's an exposure of sin in our lives. Now, that's not saying, okay, it's an if-then. If you sinned, you got this.
Right.
Okay. But what happens is when we get close to God, there's an excessive amount of light that shines on our lives because He is the light. In Him is no darkness. So what happens when you're painting a room or something and you put a real good light on it, then you find the places that you missed. Consequently, when we go through times of difficulty and we draw near to the Lord, it's His promises, He'll draw near to us. And when that happens, whoa, I've got sin in my life. Right. David even says, keep me from secret faults in Psalm 19. They're not secret to God, but they're secret to Him.
Right.
But when we get close to God, and that's why David says in these times of lament in Psalm 38 and 39 and 40 that I've been going through here at Christ Community Church, that many times he expresses, oh, man, I have sinned. And it's not the fact that he's got this because of his sin, but because he's in this situation, he's drawing near to God, and God's presence exposes more sin in his life.
Right.
Really like to read the old Puritans, and the old Puritans said over and over that they would talk about the sin in their life, and it really, when a person is walking close to the Lord, they are more conscientious of little things that are really sin that they hadn't thought about before. So the more that you grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, that happens. Well, that's kind of a mental standpoint. We don't want to miss out on the grace of God. So on the mental standpoint, we say, man, I need to not complain and become bitter, but I need to do it in a proper way, and the proper way is through a lament.
Yeah. So let's turn to the physical part of it, and I think this is kind of it's a little difficult with laments as far as the physical part of it, but it does definitely apply to the times when you don't have the desire to train, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Let's say you're just not motivated. You put off training. What happens when you miss a training session, and how can you get motivated again? To get back into it.
I think both of us have gone through times like this.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry. No, of course I have not. I'm like a machine, people.
And you know what God does to liars. But anyway, first of all, let's understand that if an athlete is in any kind of shape at all, or if you're trying to get into shape, that it takes a while for you to lose the fitness level that you have, with the following exceptions. Number one, if you didn't have a fitness level to begin with, it's hard to, you're going to lose what you have.
You're not losing anything.
You're going to lose what you have faster. But if you have an injury that makes things worse, which you need to take time off for the heal, then you can return to training. Or if the very fact that you're sick, and some people times they're sick because they've been overtraining. So let's look at that motivation. How do you get that motivation back? I think one of the ways, as I read an article recently, was you go back to the original thing that got you motivated. That's why I keep a race in front of me.
Yeah, that's so smart.
Yeah.
Always have something you're going towards.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I meant to ask Amy last night, does she have a race coming up that she's training for?
Well, I'm going to take this time to actually brag on her. So she was involved in this fitness challenge, because she has a coach that she subscribes to on the internet.
Okay.
And there's a whole bunch of people in this group. And they had a fitness challenge. I don't know how long it was. I want to say it was like 3 months. And Amy won.
Whoa.
Yeah. Now, she's really gained a lot of strength. Most of it is strength related. Her goal was to get stronger because the running had really kind of taken a toll on her. Mm-hmm. But that was her goal. And not only did she achieve it, but she actually won last night. And then guess what? She won another goal because she won a free entry into a Spartan sprint race.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So, and a bunch of other really cool stuff. But, yeah, she always keeps something dangling in front of her. Yeah. Always keeps a carrot of some kind or another out there. And I think that's super important because if you don't, then all you're doing is the same thing over and over again. It turns into Groundhog Day, you know. Just over it. Oh, look, he didn't see it. Yeah, you know.
Okay. Well, here are some excuses that some people have. Okay. Number one, I don't have time to train.
Oh, that's my favorite.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the most common.
Okay. Number two is I don't feel 100%. I think I'm not going to train today. I don't know if you ever feel 100%.
I was going to say, I don't remember when I felt 100%.
I'll make it up tomorrow. One practice won't make a difference. Okay. Or how about the weather's too cold, rainy, or windy around here? I think it's too hot. Right?
Man, you know something, man? I agree with that. But
of course, the folks that are listening up in Wisconsin think we're crazy. Another excuse, I'm too tired. I need a day of rest. Sometimes that's true. If we've both been overtraining. Or it's only practice. It's not competition. Doesn't matter if I miss it or not. Or how about this one? I still perform well even though I don't train as hard as others.
Yeah, you're fooling yourself.
Yeah. And I have a lot to do today other than training. Sometimes life does get in the way. I have a nagging injury and should rest it. So the point is, excuses pull you away from your potential. Excuses become habits. These habits have a profound impact on performance. So excuses then become the reason some athletes fall short of achieving their goals. And no matter what level of athletic you're talking about, if you're trying to just get in shape, watch out for the excuses. Here's an excuse. Buttermilk in the fridge.
That's one of my favorite excuses. I know you're going to explain that.
Yeah. There was this old preacher that told the story that one of his deacons was not being very faithful at church, so he went to see him, and he says, "Hey, you haven't been to church for a few weeks. What's going on?" He said, "There's buttermilk in the fridge." And the pastor said, "Buttermilk in the fridge? What kind of excuse is that?" He said, "It's as lame as anything else I could come up with." So there you go. Check out today's show notes at bobbrubaker.com and click on the Power Break podcast. Today's show is number 020.
And submit your questions by email to bob@bobbrubaker.com and listen for Bob's answer on an upcoming Power Break podcast.
Just before we go, I want to drop a word here for Power in the Valley. That's the book that I wrote considering all the valleys, well, not all of them, but a number of valleys. I think there are 12 of them in the Old Testament. The names, the circumstances, the meaning of that valley, and how God brought those people through that to be a very special blessing. It all started with Hosea chapter 2, verse 15, where God says, "I will give you the valley of Achor for a doorway of hope." The valley of Achor is really translated the valley of pain and affliction and trouble. So God's promises to give his people the valley of trouble for a doorway of hope. And you just kind of scratch your head. How does that happen?
Right.
That's called God's grace. Anyway, I looked at the different valleys in the Bible and in the Old Testament and their meaning behind them and some of the great blessings found in them and applied that to our daily lives and how we find those same things. We could label them as the valley of trouble or affliction or the valley of blessing. Anyway, as you look at that, check out the book. It's called Power in the Valley. It's on my website, bobbrubaker.com, and check it out today.
Well, thank you, folks, for joining us for the Power Break podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review wherever you've downloaded the podcast. And check out show notes, news, Bob's weekly blog, and other cool things at bobbrubaker.com. And listen next time for the Power Break podcast.